Some men are broken by loneliness, reduced to shadows of who they once were. Others are forged by it, tempered into steel that neither wind nor time can bend. Silas Boon belonged firmly to the latter. He was a rancher living alone on the wide grasslands at the edge of Cedar Falls. Each morning, before the sky had fully shrugged off its blanket of silver mist, Silas would brew his coffee pull on his worn leather boots and let his horse out of the barn. The steady clop of hooves on dry earth mixed with the distant bawl of cattle, a familiar kind of music in the West. But the peace of his daily routine masked a bloodstained past that the whole town still whispered about. 10 years ago, Silas had been caught in a bitter dispute over land and water rights with the Kellerman family. 3 men died in the fight. 2 of them, the father and brother of Vincent Kellerman. The law had cleared Silas of wrongdoing, but the Kellermans' wealth and their alliance with Harold Fitzgerald, the man who ran the local bank, twisted the truth. They painted Silas as a cold-blooded killer, a dangerous man to keep away from. Since then, Silas had withdrawn from the life of the town. He only rode into Cedar Falls when necessity forced him for salt barley or medicine for the stock. People crossed the street when they saw him coming. Children stared, then whispered to one another as if he were a figure from some grim legend. He had learned to live with it, just as he had learned to live with the long scar on his left shoulder, the souvenir of a near-fatal encounter years ago. Across town, Clara Wyn was living out the last days of her freedom. Her father's death had left her with crippling debts to Fitzgerald's bank. With no money to pay, she was forced into what the townsfolk called a bridal auction, a sham sale in which powerful men married women to seize their land. Clara knew all too well that if tomorrow unfolded according to Fitzgerald's plans, she'd be nothing more than a prize in his pocket. On the morning that fate shifted, Silas had ridden into town for rope and salt. The sound of the church bell carried through the streets the auction was underway. He hadn't meant to get involved, but when he saw Clara beneath that thin white wedding veil, her eyes sharp with fear, something deep inside him, something that had slept for a decade, suddenly woke. Silas Boon wasn't the kind of man to meddle in other folks' affairs. He'd learned long ago to let the saloon fights settle themselves, to ignore the bitter gossip that swirled through Cedar Falls, and to keep his own counsel. But that morning, standing in the back of the church, he knew he couldn't turn away. Fitzgerald stood at the front dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than most men made in a year. He had the look of someone already convinced he owned the bride. Outside his fine carriage waited to take Clara away, not to a home, but to a life with no say of her own. Silas's eyes went to Clara. She stood stiffly, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone white. No one in the room moved to intervene. The crowd kept their eyes down, as though unwilling to catch whatever curse might fall on the man who stood against Fitzgerald. He dropped the reins at the church door and strode inside. The hollow thud of his boots against the wooden floor made heads turn. Without hesitation, he walked up the aisle past startled whispers and wide eyes until he stood right beside Clara. "She's not going with him," Silas said, his voice low, but carrying to the last pew. Then before anyone could stop him, he turned and kissed her. Not the gentle kiss of a suitor, but the claiming of a man making a vow before God and the law. Father O'Brien blinked in shock. "Mr. Boon, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I'll marry her," Silas replied, his gaze locked on Fitzgerald. "Right now." Gasps rippled through the church. Some shook their heads. Others leaned forward, eager to see what Fitzgerald would do. The banker's smile was thin, his eyes dark with rage. He wasn't used to having what he wanted taken from him, and certainly not in front of an audience. Clara stood frozen. She had never spoken to Silas before today, only heard the rumors, the dangerous reputation, the stories of blood on his hands. Why was he doing this? Was he after her land, or was this just some wild impulse? Silas offered no explanation. He didn't need to. In that moment, something in him had shifted, and he knew life on the ranch would never be the same. As they walked out together, he felt the weight of the town's eyes on his back. Some were shocked. Others burned with the promise of trouble to come. He had struck a spark in a field of dry grass, and in the west, once a fire started, no man could say how far it would spread. The road from Cedar Falls to Silas's ranch stretched wide and empty, lined with sun-bleached fence posts and scattered patches of prickly pear. It was late spring, the air warm, but still carrying the cool breath of last night's rain. Clara sat behind Silas on his tall black gelding, careful to keep a polite distance, though the sway of the horse brought her close enough to catch the scent of leather and dust that clung to him. When the ranch finally came into view, her breath caught. It wasn't the small clapboard house she'd imagined, but a sprawling spread-a-main house with smoke curling from the chimney. A long barn, a hayloft, and cattle grazing across fields that seemed to roll on forever. Silas led the horse into the barn and spoke over his shoulder. "You'll sleep in the main house. Mornings start early. Everyone works." It was not an invitation. It was an order. Clara simply nodded. Inside the house was plain but clean. A sturdy oak table, a brick hearth still faintly warm from the morning's fire shelves lined with weathered books. She set down her shawl, feeling a strange mix of safety and unease. At dawn, a sharp knock at her door pulled her from sleep. "Up. Barn first," Silas's voice called. When she stepped outside, the world was bathed in a pale, golden light. Silas handed her a pail of feed and pointed toward the stalls. The barn smelled of hay-horse sweat and old wood. A dozen horses turned their dark eyes toward her. Silas showed her how to pour the oats, how to stroke a horse's mane to calm it. Clara hesitated, then reached out to touch the dapple gray nearest her, surprised at the heat under its coat and the steady rhythm of its breath. When the feed was done, Silas took her along the southern fence line. He worked quickly, mending a section of barbed wire that had sagged while she held the cedar posts steady. The wire bit into her soft hands, raising a sting, but she said nothing. Silas glanced at her, once perhaps noticing, but offered no comment. By the time the sun was high, they returned to the house. Silas washed his hands in a basin, poured her a glass of cool water from a clay jug. There was no smile, no word of praise, but something in his eyes had shifted, just slightly. Clara realized then that in this place trust wasn't given in speeches. It was built in the quiet moments in the work shared side by side. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened, with the kind of quick-moving storm the plains were famous for. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, and the air carried that sharp metallic scent that always came before rain. Clara was gathering laundry from the line when she saw Silas crossing the yard from the cattle pens, one hand pressed tight to his side. "Silas," she called, rushing to meet him. The sleeve of his shirt was soaked through, darkened by blood. "Just a scratch from the barbed wire," he said, brushing past her toward the porch. "Nothing worth fussing over." She stepped in front of him, blocking the doorway. "Sit. Now." For a moment she thought he might refuse. Then he sighed, set his hat on the railing, and lowered himself onto the bench under the porch roof. Rain began to patter against the shingles above the sound, filling the silence. Clara fetched a basin of warm water, a clean cloth, and the small tin of carbolic salve she'd found in the pantry. When she lifted his shirt, the cut was longer and deeper than she'd expected, red against the pale line of an old scar. Her hands trembled only slightly as she cleaned the wound. "You let this go. It'll get infected," she murmured, focusing on her work. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read, guarded, but with something softer underneath. When she wrapped the bandage snug around his ribs, he gave a single nod. "Thank you," he said simply. 2 words. Yet in them Clara heard more than politeness. She heard the weight of a man unused to relying on anyone letting his guard drop, even if just for a moment. The rain picked up, drumming harder on the roof. Silas rose and went inside, returning with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He set one in front of her at the kitchen table. They drank in companionable silence, the air rich with the scent of roasted beans and wet earth drifting in through the open window. No long conversations, no declarations, just the quiet acknowledgement of having shared something that mattered. When the rain eased, Silas glanced toward the barn. "Tomorrow I'll teach you how to move cattle. It's not easy, but you'll manage." It wasn't quite an invitation, but it wasn't an order either. Clara understood what it meant, an opening a first step into his guarded world. And somehow, despite the storm still muttering beyond the hills, the ranch felt warmer than it had that morning. The first real trouble came a week later. It was a clear, hot morning when Silas and Clara rode into Cedar Falls for salt and horse liniment. The streets shimmered with heat dust rising in lazy spirals. As they passed the saloon, Clara noticed a crowd gathered around the bulletin board outside. At the center, freshly nailed to the wood, was a sheet of thick paper bearing bold black letters, "Wanted Silas Boon, dead or alive, $500. Reward." The grainy photograph was old, but unmistakable. The sharp jaw, the steady gaze, the hat tipped low. Clara's stomach turned to ice. She looked at Silas, but his face didn't change. He only flicked the reins and muttered, "Mount up. Now." They left the town without another word. Not until they were halfway back to the ranch did Silas speak. "That's Fitzgerald's doing," he said flatly. "It's an old warrant from years ago, dredged up to remind the town I'm trouble. He knows if people believe it, no one will stand with me." Clara's grip tightened on the saddle horn. She'd started to see through the rumors to believe that Silas wasn't the cold-blooded killer the town whispered about. But now, Fitzgerald was trying to turn the whole county against them. 3 days later, the threat became flesh and bone. They were working the southern fence line when 4 riders appeared on the ridge. They came down slow, spreading out in a loose half-circle. Each man's hand hovered near his gun. The leader was tall, sunburned, with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard there's a bounty on you, Boon," he drawled. "Figure we might as well collect." Silas straightened, the sunlight catching on the worn steel of the revolver at his hip. His voice was cold enough to cut through the heat. "This is my land. You're not welcome here. Turn around while you still can." The men shifted in their saddles, measuring him, measuring the odds. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the leader laughed, short, sharp, and jerked his head toward the ridge. "Another day," he said. They rode off in a cloud of red dust, leaving behind only the smell of sweat and gun oil. That night, the wind rattled the fence posts, and Clara lay awake in her narrow bed. The ranch felt smaller somehow, as if danger had drawn the walls in closer. She understood now that life here wasn't just about cattle and fences. It was about surviving the wolves that circled in the dark, and one wolf in particular who ruled from behind a banker's desk in town. The following afternoon, Clara went to the Old North barn in search of seed bags. The place hadn't been used in years. The roof sagged in places, and dust hung in the air like cobwebs. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning, and stepped inside. In the far corner, half buried under a pile of feed sacks, she spotted a weathered chest. The lock was rusted through. Curiosity got the better of her, and with a quick pry from a loose board, the latch gave way. Inside were a few odds and ends, a pair of cracked leather gloves, a coil of frayed rope, and a battered envelope stained dark brown. She hesitated before opening it. The paper inside was stiff and brittle, the handwriting rough and uneven. "Harold Wyn's land is yours now. The old man is done. The girl will follow. No one will ask questions if we call it an accident." At the bottom was a jagged signature, V.K. Vincent Kellerman. Clara's breath caught. Her father's death, the fall from his horse that everyone said was bad luck, hadn't been an accident. The truth was here in her hands, in ink and dried blood. And Fitzgerald had been the one to profit most from it. She clutched the letter and hurried outside. Silas was repairing the gate by the horse corral when she reached him, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, holding out the envelope. He read it in silence, his jaw tightening as he took in every word. "You're sure this is real?" he asked. "I know Vincent's handwriting. I saw it once on a cattle sale receipt. And the blood. It could be my father's. Silas folded the letter and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. His voice was low, but steady. Clara, this isn't just proof of what happened to your father. It's the kind of thing that could bring down both Fitzgerald and Kellerman if we get it into the right hands. Her pulse quickened. And if they find out I have it, then they'll come for you, he said simply, which is why we can't let them know. For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara felt the cold edge of the danger Silas lived with every day. She wasn't just a witness now. She was part of the fight. That night, wind swept down from the western hills carrying the dry scent of sage and the faint howl of a lone coyote. Inside the ranch house, Silas spread a map of Cedar Falls across the kitchen table. The bloodstained letter lay in the center beside his Colt revolver. "We can't keep this here," he said. "It needs to get to Judge Harrison. He's the only man in town Fitzgerald hasn't bought." Clara leaned forward, frowning. "If we show up together, we'll be followed." Silas nodded. "Which is why I'll draw their eyes. I'll ride a string of horses straight through Main Street tomorrow morning. Make enough noise to keep them guessing. You come in from the east, slip through the alley behind the print shop, and head straight to Harrison's office." Clara's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. "And if they catch me, you won't let them," he said, meeting her gaze. "I trust you." The next morning broke clear and sharp. Silas mounted Raven, his big black gelding, and led 4 more horses on a loose line. As he rode into Cedar Falls, the clatter of hooves echoed off the false front buildings, drawing townsfolk to porches and windows. The horses snorted and tossed their heads, dust rising around them in golden clouds. From the corner of her eye, Clara could see Fitzgerald standing in front of the bank, narrowing his gaze at Silas. She kept moving her wide-brimmed hat pulled low and her old gray coat hiding her figure. Silas turned the horses in a tight circle in the middle of Main Street, shouting commands and snapping the lead rope against the air. It was a good show, loud enough to make even the poker players in the saloon step outside. Meanwhile, Clara slipped down a side street, her boots silent on the packed dirt. The alley behind the print shop smelled of ink and damp wood. She kept her head down, glancing only once toward the street to make sure no one was following. Up ahead, the red brick courthouse rose against the morning sky. She quickened her pace, the letter pressed to her side beneath her coat. Every step seemed to echo loud in her own ears. Behind her, the muffled sound of hooves told her Silas was still at it, still holding their attention. She knew she had only minutes before the distraction wore thin. When she reached the courthouse steps, she didn't look back. The heavy oak door of the courthouse creaked as Clara pushed it open. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of old paper and polished wood. Judge Harrison sat behind a wide desk, glasses perched low on his nose as he studied a stack of legal documents. He looked up at the sound of her boots on the hardwood floor. "Miss Wyn, what brings you here?" Clara closed the door behind her and stepped forward, drawing the battered envelope from her coat. She placed it on the desk between them, her voice low but urgent. "This is proof my father's death wasn't an accident. Fitzgerald and Vincent Kellerman were involved." Harrison's brow furrowed as he unfolded the letter and read it. When his eyes reached the line about "the girl will follow," his jaw tightened. "Where did you find this?" "In an old storage chest on Silas Boon's ranch. The handwriting is Kellerman's." "The blood." She swallowed hard. "It could be my father's." The judge folded the paper carefully, as though it might crumble. "You did the right thing, bringing this to me. But if Fitzgerald learns you've been here, that's why Silas is keeping him busy right now," Clara said. Before Harrison could reply, the front door opened. 2 men stepped inside, one she recognized instantly as one of Fitzgerald's hired guns, the same man who'd loitered near the ranch weeks ago. His eyes swept the room and landed on her. "This is a courthouse," Harrison said sharply. "No business here without an appointment." The gunman lingered a heartbeat too long, his gaze heavy before turning to leave. The door closed behind them, but Clara's pulse didn't slow. Harrison rose, retrieving a leather satchel from a drawer. He slid the envelope inside and locked the clasp. "I'll see this gets into the right hands. In the meantime, you need to be careful. Tell Silas. This is just the beginning." Clara left through a side door, emerging into a narrow lane that smelled of horses and fresh bread from the nearby bakery. She kept her head down and her pace steady until the courthouse was out of sight. From somewhere in the distance came the sharp ring of horseshoes on hard-packed dirt, Silas still running his distraction. The sound was steady like a heartbeat, and for the first time that morning she felt the knot in her chest loosen. The storm rolled in just after noon, turning the horizon a hard shade of gray. Clara had barely finished telling Silas about the meeting with Judge Harrison when a plume of dust rose from the ridge beyond the pasture. A half-dozen riders came into view, the man at their head tall and broad-shouldered. His duster coat flaring in the wind. Even from a distance, Clara recognized Vincent Kellerman. Silas stepped through the ranch gate, his stance easy, but his eyes locked on the approaching men. Clara stayed a few paces behind the weight of the morning, still heavy in her chest. Vincent reined in his horse about 10 yards away, boots creaking in the stirrups. "Word in town is you've been talking to Harrison," he called, voice rough as gravel. Silas didn't flinch. "I talk to whoever I damn well please." Vincent's gaze slid toward Clara, then back to Silas. "You keep poking your nose into things that aren't yours, Boon, you're going to find trouble you can't ride away from." The air between them tightened. Silas took a single step forward, the leather of his boots grinding against the dirt. "This land's mine. This fight's mine. You want to start something here, Vincent? You'd better be ready to finish it." The men behind Kellerman shifted hands, brushing the butts of their revolvers. Clara's breath caught one wrong move, and the yard would turn into a killing ground. Vincent studied Silas for a long moment, the wind tugging at the brim of his hat. Then, with a humorless smile, he spat into the dust. "Not today." He wheeled his horse around with a sharp jerk of the reins. The others followed their departure, sending a new cloud of red earth swirling into the wind. When they disappeared over the ridge, Silas turned back toward the house. Clara followed the knot in her stomach, slowly unwinding. "You know he's not done," she said quietly. "I know," Silas replied. "But now he knows I'm not running." The first drops of rain began to fall, darkening the dust where Vincent's horse had stood. Clara looked at those marks at the trail disappearing into the hills and knew the storm wasn't just in the sky. 2 days after Kellerman's visit, the news hit Cedar Falls like a thunderclap. Harold Fitzgerald had been arrested right inside his bank, Judge Harrison himself reading the warrant, as Marshal Carter slipped the irons over the banker's wrists. Witnesses claimed Fitzgerald's face had gone pale as chalk when the bloodstained letter was read aloud in court. The bank closed its doors by sundown, its ledgers seized for investigation. Rumors swirled about land deeds, crooked loans, and bribes, all now laid bare for the county to see. Vincent Kellerman hadn't been arrested yet, but the blow to his reputation was deep. Several ranchers cut ties with him overnight. That morning, Silas rode into town to pick up supplies. This time the street didn't clear when he passed. The blacksmith gave him a nod. Mrs. Grant from the Mercantile even smiled faintly, as though testing the feel of it after years of suspicion. Clara walked beside him, noticing every shift in the air. People were still cautious, but the fear was no longer sharp-edged. By midday, Marshal Carter found Silas outside the feed store. In his hand was a folded document bearing the official seal of the county court. "All charges ever filed against you," Carter said, holding it out, "dismissed and struck from the record. You're a free man, in every way that counts." Silas took the paper slowly, his fingers curling tight around it. For a long time he said nothing, just stared at the words that finally gave him back the 10 years stolen from him. Clara saw the change in his eyes, the guarded watchfulness still there, but tempered with something lighter. On the ride back to the ranch, the sun broke through the clouds, laying gold across the wide-open fields. Silas slowed Raven to a walk, letting the breeze carry the smell of sage and warm earth. Town'll still have its gossips, he said, but they can talk all they want. They know the truth now. Clara smiled, and maybe they'll start telling a different story. Silas looked ahead toward the low hills that framed his land. Maybe. But the only story I care about is the one we're writing here. The evening sun dipped low, turning the sky above Cedar Falls into a canvas of molten gold, and rose. The cattle moved lazily toward the corrals, their silhouettes stretching long across the pasture. Clara leaned against the weathered fence, the wood warm from the day's heat. She watched the last light catch in Silas's hair as he came from the barn sleeves, rolled the faint scent of hay and leather clinging to him. "I used to think I'd live the rest of my days as a ghost," he said quietly, stopping beside her. "Kept to myself, kept my head down, waited for the years to run out. But then, you came along." Clara turned to face him, the breeze teasing loose strands of her hair. "And I thought I was nothing but a debt to be traded. You showed me I could choose differently." They stood in silence for a while, the sounds of the ranch folding around them, the low call of cattle, the creak of the barn doors, the faint rustle of wind through the dry grass. Silas rested his arms on the top rail, gazing toward the hills. A man can't change the past, but he can decide what kind of life he's going to live from here on. Sometimes, one decision is all it takes to start over. Clara smiled faintly, like deciding to kiss a stranger in the middle of a church. He chuckled, the sound low and warm. Exactly like that. The light deepened to amber shadows lengthening. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a lone horse whinnied, answered by another from the corral. "I don't know what tomorrow's going to bring," Silas said, "but I do know I'm not facing it alone anymore." Clara slid her hand into his. His palm was rough, calloused from years of rope and reins, but steady as if it had always been meant to hold hers. Over the pasture, the sun's last rays spilled across the land, catching the dust in the air until it glowed like tiny sparks. They stood together, watching the light fade into the cool blue of evening. Somewhere out there, Vincent Kellerman still breathed, and the West still had teeth. But here in this moment, there was peace, the kind earned, not given. As they turned toward the house, their shadows stretched side by side across the red earth, merging with the deepening colors of the horizon. And for the first time in years, Silas Boon felt not like a man running from his past, but one walking toward his future.